Thank you for coming. Thanks very much for coming out here today. I want to start with a poem. And let me set the stage for it. There was a young black man named Claude McKay. He was a railroad porter in 1919. Like a lot of young black men, he worked on the railroad. And he was terrified because every time he and his friends traveled from town to town, they didn't know if they were going to be arriving at a riot, a race riot. So they started carrying guns, and then when they would go to a location, they would run to their hotels with their revolvers just to make it safely. And he was so traumatized by this that one day he snuck off of work and went into a railroad bathroom and scratched out this sonnet, which he called, "If We Must Die." And the last lines of the sonnet read, "Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. And though before us lies the open grave, like men we'll face the murderous cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back." Now that poem doesn't mention race at all. And it was published in this little socialist magazine in July of 1919. And as soon as it was published, every black publication in America republished it, and every black person knew it. And they knew it for a reason, because 1919 was the year that black America woke up politically and fought back with politics in the courts and also in the streets. And to me, it's an amazing part of American history that has been forgotten, this book is an effort to try to recover it, because I think it played a crucial role in the creation of the civil rights movement that came later. It really is a story, on one level, as a fight for the Constitution of the United States of America. Not everyone who was taken to the streets with a rifle was fighting for the Constitution, but they were fighting for the principles, the basic tenets of the Constitution in terms of, I have the right to a fair trial. I have the right to buy a home where I can afford to live. I have a right to be paid as much as this person working next to me. And there were organizations like the NAACP that were fighting exactly for the fulfillment of the Constitution. And that battle began in 1919. I could easily talk for 5 hours. I probably have to my wife about this subject. I have gone through a 12-step program to not do that. So I'm really going to try to rein it in tonight. I'm going to talk briefly about some of the key points of that summer, and then I'm going to talk about one riot. I chose to talk about Washington, D.C. in July of 1919. And then I'm going to take any questions you want. And thank you again for coming. We all know about race riots. And if I met a black or a white person in the street and I said, "Tell me about a race riot," they're going to start talking about the 60s, or they might talk about 1992 in Los Angeles, and I'd ask them, "Well, what is a race riot?" And they would say, "It's black kids breaking into a Korean shoe store in Los Angeles," or black teenagers fighting with National Guardsmen in Detroit. The truth is, in the breadth of American history, overwhelmingly, race riot has meant white mobs attacking either black individuals or black communities. And that is certainly the case. The apex of that was in 1919. And James Weldon Johnson, who I'm going to rave about later because I think he's an amazing person who isn't understood enough, called it the Red Summer because it was so bloody. And it traumatized him and helped formulate his politics. W.E. Du Bois, other political leaders, really helped shape their politics. So from April to November of 1919, this racial unrest rolled across the United States. And of course, we're living in the South. As Tony pointed out, I grew up in Chicago. I grew up with a lot of prejudice toward the South. The South is that's where racial violence happens. That's where sheriffs attack black people. And certainly that did happen. There's no question of it. But I grew up and I studied history. I didn't know about the Chicago Riot of 1919, which devastated the city for a week. I didn't know about riots in Washington, D.C., or Omaha, Nebraska, or Connecticut, or San Francisco, or Bisbee, Arizona. And these race riots swept across the country. Thankfully, I don't have a PowerPoint because I would mess it up, but I would love to have just brought a map of the United States and pointed to the different places where there was racial violence in 1919. It was unprecedented, and it was in the North, in the West, everywhere. And I want to talk about, there was a lot of violence in the South too, and I'll go into that, but there were a lot of reasons for this. And broadly what was happening in 1919, we had won the war in World War I. Democracy had triumphed. And so it should have been this great moment for the United States. President Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, was in Paris. He was working on the Versailles Treaty. He was trying to craft the League of Nations. He was giving flowery speeches about how democracy had triumphed and we were entering a new age of peace. Back at home, it was absolute chaos. There was chaos all over the world. The Soviet Union had risen. There were Jewish people were being killed in the Ukraine. Armenians were being killed in Turkey. There was unrest in India. British colonial forces were shooting Indian people. It was absolutely a time of chaos. Europe was in flames. In the United States, there was runaway inflation, huge labor strikes, lots of talk by anarchists and communists about overthrowing capitalism, and there was just anxiety everywhere. There was a political cartoon that ran at the time which shows the globe in bed, just biting his fingernails while these terrible things are circling around his head. Everybody was anxious. And race played the racial conditions that were already existent in the United States flared up as a result. And there were three things that were occurring in the United States at the time that were all, on the surface, good for black people, but they led to great racial conflict. Sorry. Number one, black soldiers had fought in World War I, and they had fought extremely bravely. Many of them had worked in support units, but many had fought on the front lines and won medals, and all black soldiers in France had been treated extremely well by the French people. I was just up in Baltimore giving a talk, and I met a Baltimore Sun reporter who told me he had interviewed one of the last living African-American World War I veterans. And the man described, one of his greatest memories was describing being served escargot by French farmers, and these great meals, elaborate meals that they would present to the soldiers. And this was fantastic, and the black soldiers were being told all the time, you're fighting for democracy. We're here to win the war for democracy. When they got back, it was a much different message. There's a letter I quote in the book, a document from the U.S. Railroad Administration where black soldiers who have just come back from Europe are traveling in a railroad car, and as soon as it crosses the Mason-Dixon line, half the white men stand up and say, hey, what's this? These guys have to go back into the segregated car. And a fight ensues because some of the white men say, well, wait a minute, these guys just fought for our country. These kinds of small incidents were happening all over, and they would quickly become larger incidents later. The second major thing that was happening seems counterintuitive, but sharecroppers, the quintessentially downtrodden class in American society, did well in 1919 because commodity prices had gone through the roof. So cotton, which they would always take their cotton to be weighed and they would be ripped off almost invariably. In 1919, even if they were getting ripped off, they still made a lot of money, relatively. And so they were able to buy cars, they were buying clothes, fancier clothes, they were buying land when they could, and this caused a lot of friction throughout the South. There were efforts in some parts of the South to organize into cooperatives. The black sharecroppers would organize into cooperatives. That caused tremendous tensions. And then thirdly, there were the Great Migration was out of control. The Great Migration had begun already before World War I, but once World War I began, immigration from Europe stopped. So northern industry had to turn to the South, and black Workers willingly came up north because they were paid relatively better, and they escaped Jim Crow. Obviously,